Picture walking into a room and feeling every conversation stop, every eye turned toward you with judgment already written in their stares. Imagine being branded with a scarlet letter you never earned, condemned by whispers based on lies you can't escape. That was Lydia Grace Thornton's reality when she stepped off the dusty stagecoach in Cedar Falls, Montana territory in the autumn of 1876. A woman carrying secrets that weren't nearly as scandalous as the town believed, but whose reputation had been destroyed by circumstances far beyond her control. But here's what makes this story extraordinary. Sometimes it takes just one person willing to look beyond the whispers to see the truth. Sometimes the most respected man in town has the courage to stand up against an entire community's prejudice. And sometimes a woman everyone has written off as fallen turns out to be the strongest, most honorable person any of them will ever meet. Because what started as a small frontier town's cruel judgment against a woman they didn't understand became the most powerful love story Montana territory had ever witnessed. Lydia wasn't the brazen, immoral woman they painted her to be. She was a survivor who'd been sacrificed on the altar of other people's sins, a victim who'd been blamed for crimes she never committed. And Tobias Armstrong wasn't just another man looking for easy conquest. He was the one person in Cedar Falls with enough integrity to see past the lies to the remarkable woman underneath. This isn't just another tale of scandal and redemption. This is the story of how an entire community's capacity for cruelty was transformed by witnessing real love in action. It's about a woman who discovered that her worth wasn't determined by other people's opinions, and a man who proved that true character means standing up for what's right even when you're standing alone. Most of all, it's about how sometimes the greatest victories aren't won in battles or business deals, but on a dance floor under the stars, when one brave soul chooses love over fear and changes everything. What the good people of Cedar Falls didn't realize as they whispered their poisonous gossip and crossed their streets to avoid Lydia Thornton was that they were about to witness something that would challenge every assumption they'd ever made about fallen women. Second chances and the power of one man's unwavering faith in the woman he loves. They thought they were watching a scandal unfold, but they were actually about to see their own hearts transformed by the most beautiful love story their little town would ever know. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of Mallory's General Store with a cloud of dust and the weary groaning of horses that had traveled too many miles over rough Montana territory roads. Lydia Grace Thornton gathered her worn carpet bag and smoothed her simple brown traveling dress, steeling herself for whatever waited beyond the coach door. She'd learned long ago that first impressions in small towns could determine everything, whether you'd find work, shelter, or simply the basic human decency of being treated like a person rather than a curiosity. Through the small window, she could see Cedar Falls stretching along the valley floor like a child's toy town. Neat wooden buildings lining a single main street, church spires reaching toward the vast Montana sky, and people going about their afternoon business with the unhurried confidence of folks who belong somewhere. It looked peaceful, prosperous, and exactly like the kind of place where a woman with her reputation would find it impossible to start over. But she had nowhere else to go. "Cedar Falls," the driver called out, his voice carrying that particular weariness of a man who'd made this journey too many times to count. "End of the line for today, folks." Lydia was the only passenger left. The others, a traveling salesman, a young couple heading to claim their homestead, and an elderly woman visiting family, had all disembarked at previous stops, leaving her alone for the final 100 miles. She'd been grateful for the solitude, for the chance to prepare herself mentally for whatever welcome awaited her in this remote corner of the territory. She stepped down from the coach with as much dignity as she could muster, her legs unsteady after 3 days of constant travel. The driver, a grizzled man named Murphy, who'd been kind enough during the journey, handed down her bag with a tip of his hat. "You sure about this, miss?" he asked quietly, his eyes concerned. "Ain't too late to ride back with me to Helena. Bigger town, more opportunities for a lady on her own." Lydia managed a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Murphy, but this is where I need to be." Murphy nodded, though his expression remained doubtful. He'd heard her story during the long hours on the trail, or at least the version she'd chosen to share. A woman alone, seeking a fresh start, carrying letters of introduction that might help her find respectable work. He didn't know about the whispers that had driven her from her last three towns, about the reputation that seemed to follow her like a shadow, no matter how far she traveled. As the stagecoach rolled away toward its next destination, Lydia found herself standing alone on the wooden sidewalk, acutely aware that several people had stopped their afternoon activities to stare at the stranger in their midst. She recognized the look, part curiosity, part assessment, part wariness that all small towns reserve for outsiders until they prove themselves harmless. She lifted her chin and walked toward the general store, her boots clicking on the weathered boards. Inside, she tried to find information about lodging, work opportunities, and the general lay of the land. She'd done this dance before in other towns, though she prayed this time would be different. The bell above the door chimed as she entered Mallory's, and conversation in the crowded store immediately dropped to a murmur. Lydia pretended not to notice the way heads turned and eyes followed her movement as she approached the counter where a middle-aged man with kind eyes and graying whiskers was measuring out flour for a customer. "Afternoon," he said pleasantly. "You'd be the passenger from the Helena stage, I'd guess. I'm Bill Mallory, and this here's my establishment." "Lydia Thornton," she replied, grateful for his welcoming tone. "I'm looking for information about lodging in town, and possibly employment opportunities." "Well now," Mallory said, wiping his hands on his apron, "Mrs. Henderson runs a clean boarding house just down the street. As for work," he paused, studying her with the careful assessment of a man who'd spent years reading people. "What kind of work you looking for, Miss Thornton?" "I can sew, cook, clean, tend children, or keep books," Lydia replied. "I have letters of reference from my previous employers." She reached into her reticule for the carefully preserved letters, but before she could produce them, a woman's voice cut through the store's background, chatter like a knife through butter. "I wouldn't be too quick to offer employment, Bill," said Mrs. Eugenia Hartwell, the mayor's wife and Cedar Falls' self-appointed guardian of moral standards. She was a thin, sharp-featured woman in her 50s who'd been examining bolts of fabric when Lydia entered, and her voice carried the particular authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. The store fell completely silent. Lydia felt her stomach drop as every eye in the place fixed on her with sudden, uncomfortable intensity. "I beg your pardon?" Mallory asked, his tone carefully neutral. "I said you might want to be cautious about who you recommend for employment in our community," Mrs. Hartwell replied, stepping closer to the counter with the measured gait of a woman delivering a sermon. "Miss Thornton, is it? Or should I say, the former Mrs. Thornton?" Lydia's blood turned to ice in her veins. Somehow, impossibly, her past had caught up with her, even here in this remote corner of Montana territory. "I think you have me confused with someone else," she said quietly, though she knew it was useless. "Oh, I don't think so," Mrs. Hartwell continued with the satisfied tone of someone who'd just played a winning hand. "You see, my cousin lives in Bannock, and she wrote me quite a detailed letter about the situation that occurred there this past spring. Something about a married woman carrying on with her husband's business partner, and the unfortunate consequences when the affair was discovered." The words hit Lydia like physical blows. Around the store, she could hear the sharp intake of breath from the gathered customers, the whispered exchanges that would spread through town like wildfire before she could even find a room for the night. "That's not," she began, but Mrs. Hartwell wasn't finished. "Of course, I'm sure there are two sides to every story," the older woman said with false charity that fooled no one. "But I do think our community has a right to know what sort of person they're welcoming into their midst. We have families here, children, moral standards to maintain." Lydia looked around the store at the faces surrounding her, some curious, some scandalized, some already hardening into the kind of judgment she'd faced in 3 previous towns. She could see her future in Cedar Falls dissolving before it had even begun. "The situation in Bannock was not what people believed," she said quietly, knowing even as she spoke that explanations rarely changed minds once gossip had taken root. "I was accused of something I didn't do by people who needed someone to blame for their own failings." "Well, that's what they all say, isn't it?" Mrs. Hartwell replied with a thin smile. But smoke generally means fire, don't you think? Before Lydia could respond, the store's front door opened with enough force to make the bell jangle violently. A tall figure stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of leather, horses, and wide-open spaces. Even without turning, Lydia could sense the immediate shift in the store's atmosphere. The way conversations paused, the way people straightened unconsciously, the way Mrs. Hartwell's expression shifted from triumphant satisfaction to something more cautious. "Afternoon, folks," said a deep voice with the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to be raised to command attention. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Lydia turned to see the man who just entered and felt her breath catch slightly. He was tall, probably 6'2", with the kind of solid build that spoke of years spent working with his hands. His hair was dark brown with touches of early silver at the temples, and his eyes were the deep blue of mountain lakes. He wore well-made but practical clothes, dark pants, white shirt, leather vest, and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being respected. "Tobias," Mrs. Hartwell said, her voice noticeably less sharp than it had been moments before. "We were just meeting Miss Thornton here. She's new to town." The man, Tobias, looked directly at Lydia, and she was surprised by the kindness she saw in his eyes. No judgment, no calculation, just honest interest and what might have been sympathy. "Welcome to Cedar Falls, Miss Thornton," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I'm Tobias Armstrong. I hope you'll find our town to your liking." "Thank you," Lydia managed, though she was acutely aware that everyone in the store was watching this exchange with fascination. "Tobias owns the largest ranch in 3 counties," Mrs. Hartwell said, as if his presence somehow validated her earlier behavior. "One of our most respected citizens." "Mrs. Hartwell," Tobias replied evenly, "I couldn't help but overhear some of your conversation from outside. Sounded like you were sharing some interesting stories." There was something in his tone that made Mrs. Hartwell shift uncomfortably. "Well, I was simply informing the community about gossip from other towns," Tobias interrupted gently. "You know, I've always found that gossip has a way of changing in the telling. Like a children's game of whispers. What starts as one thing often ends up as something completely different by the time it makes the rounds." The reproof was mild but unmistakable. Mrs. Hartwell's face flushed slightly. "I hardly think protecting our community's moral standards can be called gossip," she said stiffly. "And I hardly think judging a person based on secondhand stories can be called Christian charity," Tobias replied. His voice remained calm, conversational, but there was steel underneath that made several people in the store look away uncomfortably. He turned back to Lydia, and his expression warmed again. "Miss Thornton, if you're looking for lodging, Mrs. Henderson's boarding house is just down the street. She runs a fine establishment, and I'm sure she'll make you comfortable." "Thank you," Lydia said, surprised by the genuine gratitude in her own voice. "That's very kind of you." "As for employment," Tobias continued, ignoring Mrs. Hartwell's sharp intake of breath, "Doc Patterson's been looking for someone to help with his practice. His wife used to assist him, but she's been poorly lately. Might be worth speaking with him if you're interested in that kind of work." It was more kindness than Lydia had received from an entire community in months. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes and had to blink them back. "I'll do that," she said. "Thank you again, Mr. Armstrong." "My pleasure," he replied. "And Miss Thornton? Don't let anyone make you feel unwelcome in Cedar Falls. We're better people than that, even if we sometimes need reminding." With that, he tipped his hat again and walked toward the back of the store to conduct his own business, leaving behind a silence that felt very different from the hostile quiet that had greeted Lydia's arrival. As she gathered her bag and prepared to leave, Lydia caught Mrs. Hartwell's eye. The older woman's expression was still disapproving, but there was something else there now. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the recognition that her attempt to publicly shame the newcomer hadn't gone quite as planned. "Good day," Lydia said quietly, nodding to the room in general before walking toward the door. Outside, she paused on the sidewalk and took a deep breath of the clean mountain air. For the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, she felt like she might actually have a chance in Cedar Falls. Not because the gossip would stop, she was too experienced to believe that, but because at least one person in town had shown her basic human decency. And sometimes, that was enough to build a life on. Dr. Ezra Patterson's medical office occupied the ground floor of a neat white building on Elm Street, distinguished from the surrounding homes by the hand-painted sign that read, E. Patterson, M.D., physician and surgeon, in precise black letters. Lydia stood before the door for a full minute, gathering her courage and trying to quiet the voice in her head that whispered she was foolish to hope that Tobias Armstrong's recommendation would carry any weight in a town where Mrs. Hartwell's poison had already begun to spread. But she had to try. After settling into Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, where the proprietress had been polite but noticeably cool, Lydia had walked the length of Cedar Falls Main Street twice, looking for help wanted signs or any indication that a woman with her particular reputation might find honest work. She'd found nothing but closed doors and curious stares from behind lace curtains. Dr. Patterson was her only real hope. The bell above the door chimed softly as she entered, and Lydia found herself in a clean, well-organized waiting room that smelled of carbolic acid and dried herbs. Medical journals were stacked neatly on a side table, and anatomical diagrams lined the walls alongside certificates from Eastern medical colleges that spoke of serious education and professional competence. "I'll be right with you," called a voice from the back room, followed by the sound of glass instruments clinking together. Lydia took a seat in one of the wooden chairs and tried to calm her racing heart. She'd helped tend the sick before. During a cholera outbreak in her previous town, she'd worked alongside the local doctor for 3 weeks straight, learning basic nursing skills that had served her well since. But that had been volunteer work, born of community crisis. This was asking a professional man to trust her with his reputation and his patients' welfare, despite the gossip that was undoubtedly already making its way through Cedar Falls like wildfire. "Now then," said Dr. Patterson as he emerged from his examination room, wiping his hands on a clean towel. He was a man of perhaps 55, with graying hair and intelligent hazel eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. His clothes were neat but practical, and he moved with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to managing his time carefully. "How can I help you today, Miss Thornton?" Lydia supplied, rising from her chair. "Lydia Thornton. I believe Mr. Tobias Armstrong may have mentioned that I was looking for work?" Dr. Patterson's expression shifted slightly, not with the disapproval she'd expected, but with what looked like relief mixed with caution. "Ah, yes," he said, gesturing for her to follow him into his office. "Tobias did stop by earlier, said there was a new woman in town who might be interested in medical assistant work." He paused, studying her with the assessing gaze of a man who'd spent decades reading people's character in moments of crisis. "I have to tell you, Miss Thornton, I've been in desperate need of help for weeks now. My wife Martha used to assist me, but she's been unwell lately, and I can't ask her to continue." Lydia settled into the chair across from his desk, noting the stacks of patient files and the general air of someone trying to manage too many tasks at once. "What kind of assistance would you need?" she asked. "Preparing instruments, mixing medications, helping with examinations when propriety requires a female presence, basic wound care, that sort of thing." Dr. Patterson removed his glasses and cleaned them absently, a gesture that spoke of long habit and deep thought. "The work can be demanding, sometimes unpleasant, and the hours are unpredictable. Medical emergencies don't keep bankers' hours." "I understand," Lydia replied. "I've helped with medical work before. During a cholera outbreak in Wyoming, I assisted Dr. Morrison for nearly a month. I have a letter of reference from him, if you'd like to see it." Interest flickered in Dr. Patterson's eyes. "Cholera work? That's not for the faint of heart. How did you handle it?" "It was necessary," Lydia said simply. "People were dying, and there weren't enough hands to help. Dr. Morrison taught me to prepare bismuth mixtures, to recognize the stages of the disease, to keep accurate records of symptoms and treatments." "And you weren't afraid?" "I was terrified," Lydia admitted, "but fear seemed less important than helping people who couldn't help themselves." Dr. Patterson leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Thornton, I have to ask you something directly, and I hope you'll forgive the bluntness. There's already talk in town about your background. Now, I don't put much stock in gossip as a general rule, but I need to know if there's anything in your past that might affect your ability to work with my patients. Some folks can be particular about who they allow to tend their ailments. Lydia felt her stomach clench, but she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. Dr. Patterson, I've never been convicted of any crime, never harmed another person, and never done anything that would compromise my ability to care for the sick. The stories that follow me are based on false accusations made by people who needed someone to blame for their own mistakes. Can you tell me what really happened? It was the first time anyone in Cedar Falls had asked for her version of events rather than simply accepting the whispered gossip as truth. Lydia drew a deep breath and made a decision that could either give her a fresh start or destroy her last chance at respectability. I was working as a housekeeper for a wealthy family in Bannock, she began. The husband, Mr. Charles Whitmore, owned several businesses and was considered one of the town's leading citizens. His wife was troubled. She drank heavily and often became violent when intoxicated. Mr. Whitmore asked me to help manage the household and keep an eye on his wife's condition. Dr. Patterson nodded, his expression neutral but attentive. Mrs. Whitmore began having an affair with her husband's business partner, a man named Gerald Hutchins. When Mr. Whitmore discovered the affair, Mrs. Whitmore claimed that I had been helping arrange their meetings, carrying messages, covering for her absences. Lydia's hands clenched in her lap at the memory. It wasn't true. I'd tried several times to discourage her from her reckless behavior, but she was not someone who accepted advice well, and they believed her rather than you. Mr. Whitmore was humiliated and needed someone to blame who wasn't his wife. The town was scandalized and needed a scapegoat who wasn't one of their prominent citizens. Lydia's voice grew quiet. I was expendable. They were not. Dr. Patterson was silent for a long moment, staring out the window at the afternoon shadows lengthening across Elm Street. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. You know, in 30 years of medical practice, I've learned that the truth about people's character usually reveals itself in how they behave during crises. When someone's sick or hurt, when they're scared or in pain, you see who they really are underneath all the social pretenses. He turned back to her. Tell me, Miss Thornton, what would you do if you were helping me treat someone who'd been spreading those stories about you around town? I'd do my job, Lydia replied without hesitation. Their medical needs would have nothing to do with their opinion of me. Even if they refused your help, even if they demanded someone else tend to them, then I'd step aside and let you handle their care alone, if that's what they preferred. But I wouldn't let personal feelings interfere with medical treatment. Dr. Patterson smiled, the first genuine warmth she'd seen from anyone in Cedar Falls, besides Tobias Armstrong. Miss Thornton, I'd like to offer you a trial period. 2 weeks, starting tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. The pay is modest but fair. $12 a week plus meals when you're working late. If we suit each other, we can discuss permanent employment. Relief flooded through Lydia so suddenly she had to grip the arms of her chair to keep from swaying. Thank you, she managed. You won't regret this decision. I don't think I will, Dr. Patterson replied. But I should warn you, some of my patients may not be welcoming at first. Mrs. Hartwell in particular sees me regularly for her nervous complaints, and she has considerable influence with the other ladies in town. I understand. Good. Now there is one more thing. Dr. Patterson opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small leather-bound book. This contains my notes on common treatments, medication dosages, and emergency procedures. I'd like you to study it tonight and be prepared to discuss it tomorrow. Can you read medical terminology? I can read Latin if that's what you're asking, Lydia replied. My father insisted on a classical education, even for his daughters. Excellent. And Miss Thornton? Dr. Patterson stood and extended his hand. Welcome to Cedar Falls. I have a feeling you're going to do very well here. As Lydia walked back toward the boarding house, the medical text tucked carefully in her reticule, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope, not just for employment, but for the possibility that she might actually be able to build a life in this small mountain town. Dr. Patterson had listened to her story, evaluated her qualifications, and judged her on her merits rather than on gossip. It was a start. The feeling of optimism lasted exactly until she reached the boarding house and found Mrs. Hartwell waiting for her in the parlor, flanked by 3 other ladies who clearly composed Cedar Falls' informal tribunal of moral judgment. Miss Thornton, Mrs. Hartwell said, rising from her chair with the air of someone about to deliver an important pronouncement. I believe we need to have a conversation. Lydia's heart sank, but she kept her voice level. About what, Mrs. Hartwell? About your employment with Dr. Patterson. You see, several of us are concerned about the propriety of having someone with your background in a position of such trust and responsibility. The other ladies nodded gravely, their expressions ranging from uncomfortable duty to self-righteous satisfaction. Lydia recognized the type, women who'd never faced real hardship themselves, but felt qualified to judge those who had. Dr. Patterson is perfectly capable of making his own hiring decisions, Lydia replied calmly. Perhaps, said Mrs. Victoria Clemens, the banker's wife, but Dr. Patterson is a man, and men can sometimes be swayed by a pretty face or a sad story. We ladies have a responsibility to protect our community's moral standards. And we've decided, added Mrs. Sarah Mills, the school teacher, that it would be best for everyone if you reconsidered your employment plans. Perhaps you could find work in a larger town, somewhere more suitable for someone in your situation. They were trying to run her out of town before she'd even had a chance to prove herself. It was Bannock all over again, and the 2 towns before that. Lydia felt the familiar weight of despair settling on her shoulders, but underneath it, something else was stirring. Not resignation this time, but anger. Ladies, she said quietly, I appreciate your concern for the community's welfare. But I've committed to working for Dr. Patterson, and I intend to honor that commitment. If you have concerns about my character or qualifications, I suggest you take them up with him. Mrs. Hartwell's eyes narrowed. Miss Thornton, I don't think you understand the situation. Cedar Falls is a small town. We look out for each other here, and we don't appreciate outsiders who bring complications to our peaceful community. What kind of complications? The voice came from the parlor doorway, where Tobias Armstrong stood with his hat in his hands, and an expression that made all 4 ladies suddenly look very uncomfortable. Tobias, Mrs. Hartwell exclaimed, her voice artificially bright. We were just welcoming Miss Thornton to town. Funny, Tobias replied, stepping into the room. From out in the hallway, it sounded more like you were trying to drive her out of town. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been hovering nervously in the background, finally spoke up. Perhaps we should all take some refreshment, she suggested weakly. I've got fresh coffee. That's kind of you, Mrs. Henderson, Tobias said. But I actually came by to speak with Miss Thornton about a business matter. If you ladies will excuse us, it wasn't really a question. The 4 women exchanged glances, clearly reluctant to leave, but equally reluctant to openly challenge the most influential man in 3 counties. Of course, Mrs. Hartwell said stiffly. Miss Thornton, we'll continue our conversation another time. I look forward to it, Lydia replied with more composure than she felt. As the ladies filed out, whispering among themselves, Tobias moved closer to Lydia. She could smell the scent of leather and pine that seemed to cling to his clothes, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle despite the steel she'd heard when addressing the other women. You all right? He asked simply. I'm fine, Lydia said, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. Thank you for the second rescue today. No rescue necessary. You were handling them just fine on your own. He paused, studying her face. I heard you got the job with Dr. Patterson. A trial position, Lydia corrected. 2 weeks to prove myself. You'll do more than prove yourself, Tobias said with quiet confidence. Doc Patterson's a good judge of character. If he hired you, it's because he saw something worth hiring. The simple faith in his voice nearly undid her. After months of being judged, dismissed, and driven away, having someone believe in her capabilities felt like a gift she didn't know how to accept. Mr. Armstrong, she began, then stopped, unsure how to express what his support meant to her. Call me Tobias, he said. And Miss Thornton? Don't let them run you off. This town needs people like you. People who aren't afraid to work hard and do what's right. The rest of it, well, gossip has a way of dying down when folks get used to seeing the truth with their own eyes. As he settled his hat on his head and prepared to leave, Lydia found her voice. Why? She asked quietly. Why are you helping me? You don't know me, Don't know if the stories are true or false. Tobias paused in the doorway, his blue eyes serious. Miss Thornton, I've lived in small towns my whole life. I've seen what gossip and snap judgments can do to good people. And I've learned that the folks who are quickest to cast stones usually have plenty of sins of their own to account for. He touched the brim of his hat. Besides, sometimes you can tell more about a person's character from how they handle being knocked down than from anything else. And you, Miss Thornton, seem to have a talent for getting back up. After he left, Lydia sat alone in the boarding house parlor as evening shadows lengthened across the floor. Tomorrow she would begin her new job, facing patients who might refuse her help and colleagues who might question her presence. The town's moral guardians would continue their campaign to drive her away, and the gossip would likely get worse before it got better. But for the first time in months, she wasn't facing those challenges alone. She had work that would use her skills, a doctor who judged her on her merits, and at least one person in Cedar Falls who seemed to believe she was worth defending. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to build on. And sometimes that's all a person needed to start over. The sun had barely cleared the mountains when Lydia arrived at Dr. Patterson's office on Monday morning, her hair neatly pinned and her hands scrubbed clean. She'd spent most of the previous evening studying the medical text he'd given her, memorizing dosages for common ailments and familiarizing herself with his treatment protocols. She was determined to prove that his faith in her hadn't been misplaced. Dr. Patterson was already at work in his examination room, preparing instruments for the day ahead. He looked up as she entered, his expression pleased but unsurprised at her punctuality. "Good morning, Miss Thornton. Ready for your first day?" "Yes, sir," she replied, removing her shawl and hanging it on the hook by the door. "What would you like me to do first?" "We'll start with the basics. The cabinets need restocking, and I've got several patients coming in for routine examinations. Watch how I work, ask questions when you need to, and don't worry about making mistakes. Everyone does it first." Their first patient arrived promptly at 8:30, Mrs. Elizabeth Crawford, an elderly widow who'd been suffering from joint pain. She was one of the few townspeople who'd spoken kindly to Lydia at church the previous Sunday, and her warm greeting helped calm some of Lydia's first-day nerves. "Oh, Dr. Patterson," Mrs. Crawford said as she settled onto the examination table. "I'm so glad to see you have help again. Poor Martha's been poorly for too long. Bless her heart." "Miss Thornton comes highly recommended," Dr. Patterson replied diplomatically. "She'll be assisting me with your examination today, if that's acceptable to you." "Of course, dear," Mrs. Crawford said to Lydia with a smile. "Any friend of Doc Patterson's is a friend of mine." The examination went smoothly. Lydia assisted with taking notes, mixing a liniment for the elderly woman's aching joints, and helping her down from the table. Mrs. Crawford thanked them both warmly and promised to return in 2 weeks to report on her progress. "One down," Dr. Patterson murmured after she left. "Though I should warn you, they won't all be that welcoming." His prediction proved accurate within the hour. Their second patient was Mrs. Margaret Sullivan, wife of the town's blacksmith, who'd come in complaining of persistent headaches. The moment she saw Lydia preparing instruments, her expression hardened. "Dr. Patterson," she said stiffly, "I wasn't aware you'd hired assistants." "Miss Thornton is helping me temporarily," he replied calmly. "She has medical experience and excellent references." "I see." Mrs. Sullivan's tone made it clear that she saw quite a lot, none of it favorable. "Well, I'd prefer to be examined without additional company, if you don't mind." Lydia felt heat creep up her neck, but she kept her expression neutral. "Of course, Mrs. Sullivan. I'll be in the front office if Dr. Patterson needs anything." She spent the next 20 minutes organizing patient files and trying to ignore the woman's pointed comments about the kind of people being allowed into positions of trust these days. When Mrs. Sullivan finally left, she made sure to speak loudly enough that Lydia could hear every word of her parting remarks about moral standards and protecting decent families. "Pay her no mind," Dr. Patterson said quietly as the door closed behind her. "Margaret Sullivan's been looking for something to complain about since her husband started spending too much time at Murphy's Saloon. Some folks find it easier to judge others than to face their own problems." The pattern continued throughout the week. About half their patients accepted Lydia's presence with varying degrees of politeness, while the others either requested her absence or made their disapproval painfully obvious. But gradually, something interesting began to happen. The patients who gave Lydia a chance discovered that she was competent, gentle, and genuinely concerned about their welfare. By Thursday, she'd successfully treated a child's infected wound, helped deliver a breech calf when Dr. Patterson was called to assist the local veterinarian, and mixed medications with a precision that impressed even the skeptical doctor. More importantly, she'd begun to earn the quiet respect of patients who valued skill over reputation. The turning point came on Friday afternoon, when young Tommy McKinnon was brought in after a fall from his horse had resulted in a badly broken arm. The boy was in agony, and his mother was beside herself with worry. "Please, Doc," Mrs. McKinnon pleaded. "He's hurting something awful. Can you help him?" Dr. Patterson examined the arm carefully, his face grave. "It's a bad break, Emma. I'm going to need to reset the bone before it starts healing wrong. Miss Thornton, I'll need you to help hold him steady." Lydia moved without hesitation, positioning herself at Tommy's head, where she could help keep him calm while Dr. Patterson worked. The boy was crying from pain and fear, his face pale and sweaty. "Tommy," she said softly, "I need you to look at me, all right? Can you do that?" The boy's tear-filled eyes focused on her face. Lydia began talking to him in a gentle, steady voice, telling him a story about a brave young cowboy who'd faced down an entire pack of wolves to save his ranch. Her hands remained steady on his shoulders as Dr. Patterson manipulated the broken bone back into position, and her voice never wavered even when Tommy's screams of pain made her want to weep. "There," Dr. Patterson said finally, securing the splint. "That should heal properly now." Mrs. McKinnon was crying with relief. "Thank you, Doc. Thank you both. I don't know what we'd have done." "Miss Thornton did the hard part," Dr. Patterson said quietly. "Keeping him calm made all the difference." Word of the incident spread quickly through Cedar Falls, as news always did in small towns. By Saturday morning, Lydia noticed a subtle shift in how some people looked at her on the street. Not acceptance exactly, but a grudging acknowledgement that perhaps she wasn't the heartless creature Mrs. Hartwell's gossip had painted her to be. The change was most evident when she encountered Tobias Armstrong outside the bank that Saturday afternoon. He'd been talking with several other ranchers, but when he saw her, he excused himself and walked over with that easy confidence that seemed to be such a natural part of him. "Miss Thornton," he said, touching his hat brim, "I heard about young Tommy McKinnon. Fine work, from what Dr. Patterson tells me." "I just helped keep him calm," Lydia replied, though she couldn't hide the pleasure she felt at his approval. "Dr. Patterson did all the real work." "That's not how Doc tells it. Says you've got the best bedside manner he's seen in 20 years. Tobias's blue eyes held something that might have been pride. "Told me you reminded him why he became a doctor in the first place. To help people, not to worry about what the gossips think." They were standing close enough that she could see the small lines around his eyes, evidence of years spent squinting into the Montana sun. He smelled of leather and horses and something indefinably masculine that made her aware of him in ways that were both thrilling and dangerous for a woman in her position. "How's the ranch?" she asked, needing to redirect her thoughts to safer territory. "Busy as always. We're preparing for the harvest dance next month. It's become quite the annual tradition in Cedar Falls. The whole community comes out, families from all the outlying ranches." He paused, his expression becoming more serious. "I was hoping you might consider attending as my guest." The invitation hung between them like a challenge. Lydia felt her heart skip a beat, but she forced herself to think practically. The harvest dance was Cedar Falls' biggest social event of the year. For her to attend, especially as Tobias Armstrong's guest, would be seen as a deliberate provocation by Mrs. Hartwell and her allies. "Mr. Armstrong," "Tobias," she corrected at his gesture, "that's very kind of you, but I don't think it would be wise. My presence would only cause talk, and you don't deserve to be dragged into the gossip surrounding me." "Let me worry about gossip," he said firmly. "The question is whether you'd like to go. Do you enjoy dancing?" Yes," she admitted. "It's been years since I've had the opportunity, but I used to love it." "Then you should go. Not because it would spite the gossips, though that's a pleasant side benefit, but because you have just as much right as anyone else to enjoy yourself. His voice grew gentler. Lydia, you can't spend your whole life hiding from what other people might think. Sometimes you have to take a stand and trust that decent folks will recognize decency when they see it. The way he said her name, with warmth and respect, and something deeper that she didn't dare examine too closely, made her breath catch. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to walk into that dance on his arm, to move across the floor with him while the whole community watched. I'll think about it, she said finally. That's all I ask. He touched his hat again. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, Lydia. You've earned it. As he walked away, Lydia realized that somewhere during their conversation, her decision had already been made. She would go to the harvest dance with Tobias Armstrong, regardless of the consequences. She'd spent too many years allowing other people's opinions to dictate her choices, too many months hiding from the possibility of joy. Maybe it was time to stop running from her life and start living it instead. But as she made her way back to the boarding house, she couldn't shake the feeling that accepting Tobias's invitation would change everything. Not just her standing in Cedar Falls, but the careful walls she'd built around her heart. Some changes, though, were worth the risk. The news of Tobias Armstrong's invitation to the harvest dance spread through Cedar Falls faster than wildfire through dry grass. By Sunday evening, it seemed like every person in town had not only heard about it, but had formed a strong opinion about the propriety of Cedar Falls' most eligible bachelor escorting the community's most controversial resident to their biggest social event of the year. Lydia learned just how widespread the gossip had become when she arrived at Dr. Patterson's office Monday morning to find Mrs. Hartwell waiting in the front room, flanked by two other ladies from what Lydia had come to think of as the town's Moral Enforcement Committee. Miss Thornton, Mrs. Hartwell said, rising from her chair with the air of someone about to deliver a sermon, we need to discuss your situation. Good morning, Mrs. Hartwell, Lydia replied evenly, hanging up her shawl and moving toward the supply cabinet. If you're here for a medical appointment, I'll let Dr. Patterson know you're waiting. I'm not here for medical treatment, Mrs. Hartwell snapped. I'm here because it's come to our attention that you've accepted an invitation to attend the harvest dance with Mr. Armstrong. My social engagements are hardly a matter of public concern, Lydia replied, though her pulse quickened. She'd known this confrontation was coming, but she'd hoped for a few more days to prepare for it. Oh, but they are, said Mrs. Victoria Clemens, the banker's wife, stepping forward with a folder clutched in her manicured hands. You see, we've taken the liberty of writing to contacts in Bannock, Wyoming, and two other towns where you've resided recently. The responses we've received paint quite a disturbing picture. Lydia's blood turned cold. She'd hoped that the distance and time would have allowed her to escape the web of lies and half-truths that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Apparently, she'd been naive. What exactly do you think you've discovered? She asked quietly. Mrs. Hartwell smiled with the satisfaction of someone about to deliver a killing blow. We've learned that you weren't simply accused of facilitating an affair, Miss Thornton. According to several very reliable sources, you were actually involved in the affair yourself, with a married man. And when his wife discovered the truth, you fled town rather than face the consequences of your actions. The accusation hit Lydia like a physical blow, all the more painful because she could see how easily people would believe this twisted version of events. It was simpler, more scandalous, and fit perfectly with the assumptions they'd already made about her character. That's not true, she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. Isn't it? Mrs. Clemens opened her folder and pulled out several letters. We have documentation, Miss Thornton. Sworn statements from reputable citizens who witnessed your inappropriate behavior. Reputable citizens who needed someone to blame for their own failings, Lydia replied, but she could hear the weakness in her own voice. How could she fight lies that had been given the weight of official documentation? The point is, Mrs. Hartwell continued, we cannot allow someone with your moral character to compromise the reputation of one of our community's finest citizens. Mr. Armstrong is clearly being taken in by your feminine wiles, and it's our duty to protect him from making a mistake that could ruin his standing in the territory. Have you considered discussing this with Mr. Armstrong directly? Lydia asked. He's a grown man, perfectly capable of making his own decisions. Men can be susceptible to certain types of women, Mrs. Clemens said with distaste, especially men who've been without female companionship for too long. It's our responsibility as ladies of the community to ensure that moral standards are maintained. Before Lydia could respond, the office door opened and Dr. Patterson entered, carrying his medical bag and wearing an expression that suggested he'd already heard voices from the waiting room. "Ladies," he said pleasantly, though his eyes were sharp, "this is an unexpected pleasure. Are you here for medical consultations?" "We're here about her," Mrs. Hartwell said, gesturing toward Lydia as if she were an inanimate object rather than a person standing 3 feet away. "Miss Thornton? What about her?" "Ezra," Mrs. Hartwell's voice took on a wheedling tone that suggested long familiarity. "Surely you can see that having someone of her background working in your practice reflects poorly on your professional reputation. We've received some very disturbing information about her past behavior." Dr. Patterson set down his bag and removed his coat with deliberate calm. "What kind of information?" Mrs. Clemens stepped forward eagerly, waving her folder. "Documented evidence of immoral conduct, adultery, and general lack of moral character. This woman has been run out of 3 different towns for her inappropriate behavior with married men." "Is that so?" Dr. Patterson's voice remained neutral. "And who provided this documented evidence?" "Respectable citizens from the communities where she's lived," Mrs. Hartwell replied. "People with no reason to lie about such serious matters." "I see." Dr. Patterson was quiet for a moment, studying the women with the same careful attention he gave to patients presenting unusual symptoms. "Ladies, may I ask what prompted you to undertake this investigation into Miss Thornton's background?" "We're concerned about the moral welfare of our community," Mrs. Clemens said stiffly, "especially given her association with Mr. Armstrong." "Ah!" Understanding flickered in Dr. Patterson's eyes. "And when did you begin this correspondence with Miss Thornton's former communities? Before or after you learned about Mr. Armstrong's invitation to the harvest dance?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and Lydia could see the uncomfortable shift in the women's postures as they realized the implications of their timing. "That's hardly relevant," Mrs. Hartwell said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Isn't it?" Dr. Patterson moved to stand beside Lydia, a gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed. "It seems to me that if you were truly concerned about Miss Thornton's character, you would have initiated this investigation when she first arrived in town. The fact that you waited until she'd begun to earn the respect of her patients and until one of our community's leading citizens showed interest in her company suggests that your motives might be less than pure." "Dr. Patterson," Mrs. Hartwell began, her voice rising, "surely you can't condone—" "What I can't condone," he interrupted quietly, "is a group of women using gossip and innuendo to destroy someone's reputation simply because they disapprove of her social associations. Miss Thornton has worked for me for over a week now, and I've found her to be competent, compassionate, and utterly professional. Whatever may or may not have happened in other towns has no bearing on her performance here. But the documentation can be fabricated, misinterpreted, or taken out of context," Dr. Patterson said firmly. "I've been better," she admitted. "Tobias, about the harvest dance. If you're about to tell me you've changed your mind because of those women's meddling, I'm going to be very disappointed in you," he interrupted gently. "I was going to say that I'd be honored to attend with you," she replied, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "But I think you should know what you're getting into. Mrs. Hartwell and her friends have documentation that makes me look even worse than the original gossip suggested. Do you care what I think about their documentation?" "Yes," she said honestly. Tobias stepped closer, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his blue eyes. "I think that people who spend their time digging up dirt on others usually have plenty to hide themselves. I think that anyone who's willing to destroy someone's reputation to protect their own social position isn't worth listening to, and I think that you've shown more grace under pressure than any of your accusers ever could." He reached out and touched her hand gently. "Lydia, I've watched you work this past week. I've seen how you treat people, how you handle responsibility, how you respond to both kindness and cruelty. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. Even if some of the accusations are true, she asked quietly. Even then, he said firmly, we've all made mistakes, done things we regret. What matters is who we choose to be moving forward. Standing there in the gathering twilight, with his hand warm on hers and his eyes holding nothing but acceptance and respect, Lydia felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time in months, she wasn't just surviving from day to day, she was actually looking forward to something. Then yes, she said, smiling despite everything. I'll go to the harvest dance with you. Good, Tobias replied, his own smile lighting up his entire face. Fair warning, though. I'm told I'm a terrible dancer. That's all right, Lydia said, feeling lighter than she had in years. I suspect we'll manage just fine. What neither of them realized was that Mrs. Hartwell was watching from across the street, her expression calculating and her mind already working on the next phase of her campaign to drive Lydia Thornton from Cedar Falls once and for all. The week leading up to the harvest dance passed in a blur of whispered conversations and pointed stares that followed Lydia wherever she went in Cedar Falls. Word of her acceptance of Tobias Armstrong's invitation had spread through the community like spilled ink on white cloth, staining everything it touched with speculation and judgment. But something had changed in Lydia since her confrontation with Mrs. Hartwell's moral tribunal. Instead of shrinking from the attention, she held her head high and went about her business with a quiet dignity that seemed to unsettle her critics more than any defensive protest would have. At Dr. Patterson's office, her work continued to speak for itself, earning grudging respect even from patients who disapproved of her social arrangements. It was Thursday afternoon when she encountered the first real test of her newfound resolve. She was leaving Murphy's Dry Goods with fabric for a new dress, a simple blue cotton that Mrs. Murphy had helped her select with surprising kindness, when she nearly collided with a familiar figure on the sidewalk. Charles Whitmore stood before her like a ghost from her worst nightmares, impeccably dressed and wearing the same coldly handsome features that had once made the ladies of Bannock twitter with admiration. His pale eyes swept over her with calculating assessment, and his mouth curved in the predatory smile she remembered all too well. Miss Thornton, he said smoothly, tipping his hat with mock courtesy, what an unexpected pleasure to find you here. Lydia's hands tightened on her package, but she kept her voice level. Mr. Whitmore, I must say I'm surprised to see you so far from Bannock. Business brings me to Montana territory, he replied, though his eyes never left her face. Mining investments, you understand. Quite lucrative, if one knows the right people to influence. The implication hung between them like a threat. Lydia knew exactly what kind of influence Charles Whitmore wielded, the kind that bought silence, destroyed reputations, and ruined lives with casual cruelty. I trust your wife as well, Lydia said pointedly. Charles's smile widened, showing teeth that reminded her unpleasantly of a wolf. Helena is as delicate as ever. The poor dear still suffers from her nervous condition, though she's learned to be more discreet about her recreational activities. How fortunate for you both. Indeed. Charles moved closer, close enough that she could smell the expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask something rotten underneath. You know, Miss Thornton, I've been hearing the most interesting stories about your new life here in Cedar Falls. Something about a romance with a wealthy rancher? My personal affairs are none of your concern, Mr. Whitmore. Oh, but they are, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear. You see, I've had some fascinating conversations with certain ladies of this community. Mrs. Hartwell, in particular, has been most receptive to learning the truth about your character. Lydia's blood ran cold as the pieces fell into place. You're the source of their documentation. Let's just say I've been happy to provide concerned citizens with accurate information about your past behavior. Charles examined his manicured fingernails with affected boredom. Amazing how willing people are to believe the worst when it's presented with the proper authority. Why? The word came out sharper than she'd intended. Why follow me here? Why not just let me disappear? Charles's mask of civilized charm slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly and vindictive underneath. Because you know things, Miss Thornton. You were in my house, saw things that certain people would find very interesting if they ever came to light. I prefer my secrets to remain buried, and that includes the people who might be tempted to share them. The threat was unmistakable. As long as Lydia remained visible, successful, or happy, she represented a potential danger to whatever schemes Charles was running. Her very existence was a reminder of truths he wanted forgotten. "I never told anyone about what I saw in your house," she said quietly. "I never would have." "Perhaps not," Charles agreed, "but your silence was much more assured when you were a disgraced woman running from town to town. Now that you've found yourself a respectable position and an influential protector." He shrugged eloquently. "Well, people in secure positions sometimes develop inconvenient consciences." Before Lydia could respond, a familiar voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "Miss Thornton," Tobias Armstrong said as he approached from across the street, his eyes fixed on Charles with the kind of attention a hawk might give a snake. "Is everything all right here?" "Everything's fine," Lydia replied, though her voice betrayed the strain she was feeling. "Mr. Armstrong, may I present Mr. Charles Whitmore of Bannock?" "Mr. Whitmore, this is Tobias Armstrong." The two men sized each other up with the instant assessment that came naturally to those accustomed to reading potential threats. Charles was taller and more elegantly dressed, but there was something soft about him, pampered. Tobias had the solid presence of a man who'd built his success with his own hands and wasn't afraid to defend it the same way. "Mr. Armstrong," Charles said with false warmth, "I've heard so much about you. Miss Thornton was just telling me about your upcoming social engagement." "Were you?" Tobias replied evenly, though Lydia could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. "And what brings you to Cedar Falls, Mr. Whitmore?" "Business interests. I'm always looking for new opportunities to invest in growing communities." Charles's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "In fact, I was just telling Miss Thornton how much I'd enjoy attending your harvest dance. Such a charming local tradition." The words hit like a physical blow. Charles attending the dance would destroy any hope Lydia had of beginning fresh in Cedar Falls. His mere presence would validate every whisper, every accusation, every piece of documentation that Mrs. Hartwell had used against her. "I'm afraid the dance is primarily for community members and their invited guests," Tobias replied with polite firmness. "Oh, I'm sure accommodations could be made," Charles said smoothly. "After all, I'm such an old friend of Miss Thornton's. We have so much history to discuss." Lydia felt the walls closing in around her. This was how it had ended in the other towns, with Charles or someone like him appearing just when she'd begun to hope, destroying whatever small happiness she'd managed to build. "If you'll excuse us, Mr. Whitmore," Tobias said, offering Lydia his arm with deliberate courtesy. "Miss Thornton and I have an appointment." "Of course," Charles replied, though his eyes promised that this conversation was far from over. "Miss Thornton, I do hope we'll have another chance to catch up soon. There's so much I'd like to share with your new friends about our time together in Bannock." As they walked away, Lydia could feel Tobias's eyes on her profile, reading the fear and despair that she was trying so hard to hide. "Want to tell me what that was really about?" he asked quietly when they were out of earshot. "He's the man from Bannock," she said simply, "the one whose business partner was having the affair with his wife. And he's here to cause you trouble." It wasn't a question. Tobias had read the situation with the same quick intelligence that had built his ranch into a success. "He's here to destroy me," Lydia corrected. "Again. He can't afford to have me settled and happy somewhere, because settled and happy people sometimes develop inconvenient consciences about the things they've witnessed." Tobias was quiet for a long moment as they walked toward the edge of town, where the main street gave way to prairie and mountain views. When he spoke, his voice carried a hard edge she'd never heard before. "What did you witness, Lydia?" She glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then spoke in barely above a whisper. "His wife, Helena, wasn't just having an affair with his business partner. Charles knew about it from the beginning, encouraged it even. Gerald Hutchins was stealing from their joint mining ventures. But Charles had arranged it so that if anyone investigated, all the evidence would point to Helena's lover rather than to him. So when the affair was discovered, Gerald fled town to avoid prosecution, taking what he thought was his stolen money, but was actually Charles's way of cleaning out their partnership accounts. Helena was publicly humiliated and privately threatened into silence. And I was blamed for facilitating the whole thing, making me the perfect scapegoat for everyone involved. Tobias stopped walking and turned to face her. And Charles Whitmore gets to play the role of the wronged husband who's forgiven his unfaithful wife, while he's actually the one who orchestrated the entire scheme. Exactly. But if anyone ever suspected the truth, he'd need to make sure you weren't around to confirm it. Tobias's jaw clenched. Lydia, this man isn't just trying to run you out of town. He's trying to destroy your entire life to protect his own reputation. I know. The words came out smaller than she'd intended. And he's going to succeed, just like he did in Bannock and the 2 towns after that. By the time he's finished telling his stories at the harvest dance, no one in Cedar Falls will want anything to do with me. That's where you're wrong, Tobias said firmly, because this time, he's not dealing with isolated communities who only knew you as a stranger. This time, he's dealing with people who've seen what kind of person you really are. Tobias, you don't understand. I understand that you're scared, and I understand why, he interrupted gently, but I also understand something that Charles Whitmore doesn't. This isn't Bannock, and I'm not some distant authority figure who can be bought or intimidated. I'm a man who's seen you save a child's arm, watched you face down a room full of hostile gossips, and observed you choose dignity over self-pity even when the whole world seemed to be against you. He reached out and took her hands in his touch warm and steady and infinitely reassuring. Let him come to the dance, Lydia. Let him tell his lies and spread his poison, because this time, instead of facing him alone, you'll have allies. People who know your character, who've seen your heart, and who won't be swayed by the manipulations of a man who's clearly desperate to keep his own secrets buried. And if you're wrong, if the community chooses to believe him over me, then they don't deserve you, Tobias replied simply. But I don't think I'm wrong. I think Charles Whitmore is about to discover that destroying someone's life is much harder when that person has finally found the strength to fight back. As they stood there in the gathering twilight, with the mountains rising around them like ancient guardians, Lydia felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the courage to stop running. Charles Whitmore had followed her to Cedar Falls, expecting to find the same broken, isolated woman he'd destroyed before. Instead, he was going to face someone who had learned that her worth wasn't determined by other people's lies, and who had finally found people willing to stand with her against those lies. The harvest dance was 3 days away, and for the first time, Lydia found herself looking forward to the battle. The harvest dance was held in Cedar Falls Community Hall, decorated with autumn leaves and strings of lanterns casting warm golden light across the wooden floor. By the time Tobias arrived to escort Lydia, the hall was filled with fiddle music and laughter, couples spinning across the dance floor while children darted between the adults. Lydia had chosen her simple blue dress, but she'd transformed it into something special, with a cream-colored sash and her mother's pearl earrings. She looked beautiful, but more importantly, she looked confident, like a woman who belonged exactly where she was. "Ready?" Tobias asked as they approached the entrance. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, knowing this was about much more than dancing. The moment they stepped through the doorway, conversations paused and heads turned, but the reaction wasn't entirely negative. Lydia saw genuine smiles from Mrs. Crawford, young Tommy McKinnon and his mother, and even Bill Mallory from the general store. "Miss Lydia," Tommy called out, breaking away from his friends. "You came. Ma said you might not, but I told her you weren't the kind to let mean talk stop you." As they made their way deeper into the hall, Lydia realized the community response was more divided than expected. While Mrs. Hartwell and her allies watched with scandalized disapproval, many townspeople seemed genuinely pleased to see her. People who'd witnessed her work, seen her competence and kindness firsthand. The music struck up a waltz, and Tobias turned to her with an elaborate bow. "Miss Thornton, would you do me the honor?" As they moved onto the dance floor, Lydia was surprised by how natural it felt to be in his arms. Despite his claims about being a terrible dancer, Tobias moved with confident grace, guiding her through the steps with gentle pressure and whispered instructions that made her smile. For several songs they danced and laughed, drawing approving nods from community members who'd grown to respect Lydia. She was beginning to think her fears had been overblown. Then she saw him. Charles Whitmore stood in the doorway, impeccably dressed in an expensive black suit. Beside him stood Mrs. Hartwell, her face bright with triumphant anticipation. The music seemed to fade as Charles made his way across the room with deliberate steps. "Ladies and gentlemen," Charles said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent hall, "I apologize for interrupting, but I feel I have a moral obligation to share some information about one of your guests." Lydia felt Tobias's arm tighten around her waist, but she forced herself to stand tall and meet Charles's gaze directly. "Miss Lydia Thornton and I are old acquaintances from Bannock," Charles continued. "Very close acquaintances. She worked in my household where she not only facilitated an affair between my wife and my business partner, but participated in it herself." A murmur ran through the crowd. Mrs. Hartwell nodded approvingly, as if Charles was confirming everything she'd told her allies. "That's an interesting story, Mr. Whitmore," Tobias said calmly. "But I wonder if you'd care to tell the rest of it. The part about how you orchestrated the entire scheme to steal from your business partner while using your wife as a pawn?" Charles's confident expression faltered. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" Dr. Patterson stepped forward. "Because I contacted Dr. Morrison in Bannock. He had interesting things to say about your wife's injuries during that period. Bruises consistent with physical violence, terror whenever you were present during medical examinations." "My wife has always been delicate," Charles said desperately. "The way she was delicate when you blackmailed her into the affair to provide cover for your financial crimes." Lydia spoke clearly. She reached into her reticule and pulled out a folded paper. "This is a letter from your wife, Mr. Whitmore. She sent it after learning you planned to come here. Would you like me to read it aloud?" Charles stared at the letter as if it were a snake. "You're bluffing." "My dear Miss Thornton," Lydia began, "Charles forced me into the affair with Gerald, then arranged for Gerald to steal money that Charles wanted stolen anyway. When you tried to warn me, Charles decided you knew too much." "Stop," Charles said sharply. "No one would believe that a man would sacrifice an innocent woman to protect criminal activities?" Tobias interrupted. "The territorial marshal is very interested in your mining claims, filed under false names with forged documents." Charles looked around the hall, seeing his audience was no longer sympathetic. Instead of scandalized citizens ready to condemn Lydia, he faced a community beginning to understand they'd been manipulated. Mrs. Crawford, the elderly widow, stepped forward. "Eugenia Hartwell, you've been spreading gossip about that girl from day one. Miss Thornton has done nothing but good work, helped sick children, conducted herself with more dignity than you've shown in years." "That's right," called a voice from the crowd. "She saved my Tommy's arm." "Been nothing but helpful every time I've seen her," added another. Charles, seeing opinion turning against him, made one final desperate attempt. "Even if some of what you're saying is true, Miss Thornton was still involved." He never finished. Tobias's fist connected with his jaw, sending Charles stumbling backward. "That," Tobias said calmly, "is for following an innocent woman from town to town, destroying her reputation to cover your crimes." Charles pulled himself upright, blood trickling from his mouth. When he looked around the hall, he saw no sympathy, only cold judgment from people who'd finally seen his true nature. "This isn't over," he said through gritted teeth. "Yes, it is," Dr. Patterson replied firmly. "The marshal's already on his way to ask about those mining claims." Charles left without another word, followed by Mrs. Hartwell and her few remaining allies. As the door closed, the hall erupted in conversation. Not scandalized whispers, but outrage at Charles's manipulation and growing respect for Lydia's courage. The fiddle struck up again, and couples returned to the dance floor. Dr. Patterson approached with a warm smile. "Miss Thornton, I believe you promised me a dance." When that dance ended, Tobias was waiting, his eyes bright with pride. "So," he said, offering his arm, "how does it feel to finally be free?" Lydia looked around at faces of people who'd become friends, who'd seen her at her lowest and chosen to believe in her anyway. She thought about the future, work she loved, a community that valued her, and a man who'd stood by her. "It feels like coming home," she said simply. As they moved back onto the dance floor, spinning beneath the golden lanterns while the community celebrated around them, Lydia realized Charles had unknowingly given her the greatest gift. By forcing her to finally stand and fight, he'd helped her discover she was stronger than she'd known. And the people worth having were those who'd stand with her through battles. The harvest dance continued long into the night, but for Lydia Thornton, it marked not just the end of her running, but the beginning of the life she'd always deserved to live. 6 months after that fateful harvest dance, Lydia Thornton, now Mrs. Lydia Armstrong, stood in the doorway of her own home, watching her husband work with the horses in the morning corral. The scandal that had once threatened to destroy her had become nothing more than a cautionary tale about the dangers of believing gossip over evidence, and she had become one of Cedar Falls' most respected citizens. Charles Whitmore had been arrested by the territorial marshal and faced charges for fraud, forgery, and theft. His wife Helena had filed for divorce and moved to California to live with relatives, finally free from the man who'd controlled and terrorized her for years. Mrs. Hartwell, humiliated by her role in Charles's scheme, had moved to live with her sister in Denver, leaving Cedar Falls to rebuild its reputation for fairness and Christian charity. But the most beautiful change was in Lydia herself. The woman who'd once cowered from whispered accusations now walked through town with her head held high, greeting neighbors who'd learned to value character over reputation. Her work with Dr. Patterson had evolved into a respected position as the territory's first certified nurse, and her home had become a gathering place for women who needed medical advice or simply someone who understood what it meant to survive injustice. As Tobias caught sight of her in the doorway and smiled, that same warm, accepting smile that had first shown her she was worth defending, Lydia reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She'd learned that running from lies only gave them power, that standing up for truth required courage she'd never known she possessed, and that the right community would see her heart rather than her history. What do you think of Lydia's incredible transformation from outcast to beloved community member? Have you ever felt judged by people who didn't know your whole story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story of finding where you truly belong might inspire someone else still searching for their place. If stories like Lydia's speak to your heart, tales of courage over fear, truth over gossip, and love that sees past society's judgments, subscribe to Wild West Stories and hit that notification bell. Remember, your worth isn't determined by other people's opinions, and sometimes the greatest victories come from simply refusing to run anymore. Until our next frontier adventure, keep believing that there's a place where you'll be valued exactly as you are, and people who will stand with you when the world seems against you. Your harvest dance moment might be just around the corner.